Okay, good evening. So we can start. Oh, where everyone's here present. Okay, we have 100% attendance. Very good. Um. Okay. At the rate we're going, I think we would be over in terms of our lectures. If not next week, then definitely the week after next. If I can just check the calendar. Okay. Uh, May. Okay. Right now it is May 5th. So we will be having a lecture on the 12th and the 19th, although there's a possibility that I think by next week, the 12th, I could finish. Okay. And your examination is still tentatively scheduled the first week of June during the examination week. Okay, to still push through on, I think it's the Wednesday during that week in June. Okay, and you all have to take the examination. Okay? Not taking that examination will be an automatic C, not fulfilling the mid part. Okay, but as for your research paper and your videotape, I have already revised the deadline. The deadline is now April of 2020. I am working on the fearless forecast and the hope against hope that based upon an announcement made by the president of the university, there might be a possibility that by January next year, uh, we can start some on-campus activities. Okay? Given that, well, the government has said that they're hoping there'll be some herd immunity through vaccination by November, at least in the NCR plus area. So that's why the deadline will be, I think it's 29th of April 2022, on the assumption that we go back to the old calendar where the first semester begins in middle of January and ends in the last week of May. Last week of May? No, middle of May. Middle of May. So I decided to put the deadline 29th of April. So I'll have time to go over the papers. But for those, so you can submit your papers anytime during that time. But if you're able to submit your paper by, I think that would be the Friday of June 2021, then you could get your grade in this course already this semester. But if you'll be submitting until much later, then you just get a grade of incomplete. But you'll have to take the examination. Okay. So that's one matter, one issue. The other thing is this: I've already consulted with a number of you. Actually, a number of you consulted with me. So I think you might find it a benefit if I were to tell you about some of the advice that I gave to those who are working on research papers. Okay. For all of you, you come to me and you tell me, this is your topic, this is your research question. And then I usually will ask, okay, from which theory you get the research question? And then you say, well, it's this. And then I said, who's the author or the authors? Okay. A theory cannot be identified just by saying, uh, it's an international trade theory. It's a human capital theory. No, no. There are many international trade theories. There are many human capital theories. That's why you have to identify the author's name. And also that's the reason why I have to know the author's name, because some of you will tell me, sir, I'm using Ricardo's comparative advantage. I said Ricardo's comparative advantage has been refined already to make it more updated and more in the 20th century tradition of economics, where the theory is presented in a mathematical form. That's why after Ricardo, ginagamit na natin yung si Haberler. But there's still variations on the theory of comparative advantage. May theory of dynamic comparative advantage, si Bhattacharya. Ayun pala kasi ang problema, marami sa inyo sasabihin, okay, there's my research question, sir. And sir, I have not yet found a particular theory that focuses on this research question. So I have two answers. The first is, then you might need a second theory. And my second answer, you're doing it all wrong. Okay? Pag may topic ka, okay, ayan, may topic ka na. Say your topic is poverty. Poverty or employment or inequality. Pag may topic ka na, huwag ka mong gagawa-gawa ng research question. Start reading up on, poverty, employment, inequality, and most especially start reading up on theories. In addition to reading up on theories, read up on the empirical models, yung mga econometric models. And many of these papers, they're econometric models and all that, may econometric models sila, tests and the like, may conclusions sila. So itong mga papers ito, may conclusion. Just as yung mga established theories, may conclusion. Doon yung kinukuha ang inyong research question. So that's why when you come to me for understanding ko, anong research question, saan theory niyan nakuha? I was about to say napulo. So derogatory. So anyway, so that's how you do it. Para mas dumali ang research. Kasi remember, the purpose of this research paper is not for you to understand the situation of poverty, the situation of inequality, of employment. That's part of it, but the primary purpose of the research paper is for you to learn from economic development. And what are you supposed to learn? You are supposed to learn that you have a lot of theories, and these theories have been used in other countries. So now you will use these theories to explain the data in the Philippines, or preferably Philippines and other countries. And in the end, in addition to discussing the conclusion, effectively what you learned, the more important part is for you to appraise the theory and say, to what extent has the theory been able to explain your data? Okay. And then what aspects of your topic does your theory not able to explain, or it's actually outside scope of your theory? So that's the aim of the paper. Then next is that although I encourage you to begin to look at the econometric models and the like, you're not supposed to do any econometric testing, not even a statistical test. Okay? You will simply analyze the data by inspection and the use of basic descriptive statistics. So if your data is panel or cross-sectional, then you're supposed to present mean, standard deviation, the range of values. If it's a time series, you would talk about trends, growth rates, trends in the 1980s compared to 90s, um, 2000s, 2010s, okay? But you're not supposed to do any econometric modeling, nor are you supposed to do any uh, statistical test, not even a correlation. Because remember, the exercise is simply for you to use the theory to try and analyze the data. All right? Yan. So that's what you're supposed to do as far as the research paper is concerned. Moreover, uh, the research here is, in many ways, you have to also see it as a preparation for your course in economic research. You've learned your micro and macroeconomic theories, and now you've learned your um, economic development. You're learning the various theories that talk about long-term change, and many of which are modifications or extensions of micro and macroeconomic theories. For doctoral students, you also had to take uh, history of economics, and part of what you learn for history of economics is to also see the development of theories within historical context. Okay? And of course, you learn your mathematics, your statistics, econometrics. Then with your electives, all of these, you'll end up focusing on writing a research papers, economic research. Doon, okay, you will have to adopt. Yes. So hindi lang theory and research question. Pagdating mo sa economic research, you now have to adopt an empirical model. Okay? At yun ang gagawin ninyo, gagayahin ninyo. You'll adapt the empirical model to somebody multiplication and all. Okay? You never do your own econometric model. You never. Okay? You get it from someone else and you adapt it for Philippine data, which is also helpful in analysis kasi among the things that you do when you do your analysis, your approach is that when you analyze the results here on Philippine data, you will have another paper to make comparisons with. Okay, but that's for economic research. Tsaka para dun sa mga kailangan magsulat ng thesis, those who are MA thesis track, I presume you're hoping you could get in the University of San Francisco exchange beginning kailan yung San Francisco? January. Okay. It's always in January. Or if you're a doctoral student, therefore you really have to write a doctoral thesis, I would always advise na para dumali-dali ang inyong pag-aaral, okay, ah, yung paper na isusulat niyo sa economic research ay see it already as your thesis. In fact, kung thesis student ka, at the end of the research paper writing, I usually set up a defense where I ask or you ask another member of the faculty, sit down and be the reader. And among the things that we did, and then, when you make your presentation, make questions and answers, and then we'll ask you to step out while your reader and I discuss the results. It's like a proper thesis defense, except that isa lang ang reader. Normally sa thesis, tatlo ang committee. Hindi lang ako ang if I were the teacher in economic research, hindi lamang ako magdidesisyon kung yung paper mo ay pwede na i-defend. Pag masteral and doctoral dissertation, tatlo kami, may dissertation committee, and then we agree kung pwede na itong i-present. Okay? Tapos sa doctoral thesis, pati yata sa masteral, I remember, they have to invite professor from another university. It's required by CHED na may external reviewer. Okay. But in any case, nangyayari kung kayo thesis students, among the things we ask is, "O puwede na ba itong gawing thesis nila?" Okay. Masteral thesis or doctoral research. Usually they would say, "Oo, puwede na." Well, normally hindi. Sasabihin nila, "Puwede na ito, pero may mga dapat idagdag para maging thesis talaga, master's or doctoral dissertation." Para dumali-dali ang pagtatapos ng inyong research. Ngayon 'pag hindi naman kayo thesis students, MA or just after completing your MA, very good still. But the important thing is once you complete your research paper, we encourage all of you to try and see if the research paper can be submitted for publication in a journal. Kahit yung paper niyo dito, you can submit it in a journal. There are some journals uh, who do not necessarily require an econometric model, especially journals which are scholarly, but they take in from sociology, psychology, economics. Usually pagdating sa economics at saka sa psychology, they would normally ask them to remove any econometrics or what kasi nga medyo general ang audience scholarly. So your research paper here, you can submit it here. And your MA thesis, yeah, I also encourage you to submit it to journals. Mga doctoral dissertation, you are required to submit a portion of your dissertation for journal publication. In fact, ang requirement yata is before they certify that you completed the requirements, you at least would show that you submitted it. Doesn't have to be accepted yet, but nag-submit ka na. Okay, so are there any questions about your research paper and about our schedule for the rest of the semester? Okay, so I cannot proceed from where we left off unless you write your question in the chat. I look, wala naman. Okay, maybe you can ask me later. Okay, so let's proceed um, from where we left off last time. Okay, so here we are. Our topic is capital and finance in the process of economic development. And I discussed in the last class that when we're talking about capital and finance, we are essentially talking about money and money as a commodity. And that money as a commodity has some peculiarities. Okay, so money is a commodity, therefore as a commodity, um, it has a demand, it has a supply. The peculiarity of money is that it has two types of demand. It's a commodity that is multi-use. If you recall the lectures I had in environment, where I mentioned to you that there are many commodities like real estate that have multiple uses, each use associated with a certain value. And that's why, because there are multiple uses, and therefore there are multiple demands, which means that the demand for it increases very, very rapidly. The case of money, that's another one, but money is special in the sense that money is the one commodity, is present in all transactions, present in all transactions. First is that because money is anything that is supposed to, anything that is acceptable for what is known as a medium of exchange. Okay, and when we talk of money as a medium of exchange, okay, We're talking here about the fact that people need to get money, mainly because they're after the goods. People want to obtain the goods, or people want to sell the goods for them to earn a living. They want to buy the goods to maximize their utility. And the most efficient way of doing this is through money. So it's a medium of exchange. Medium in the sense of being in between the buyer and the seller. It makes the transaction much more efficient, much faster. And the medium of exchange function of money, okay, is what it plays in what is known as the transactions demand for money. And the transactions demand for money, which is the demand for money in order to obtain goods and services, is very stable. It's very stable. I've discussed the stability of the demand for goods and services back in the Harrod-Domar growth model. And you also learn that from your macroeconomics when you studied the consumption function. Then you have life cycle hypothesis of consumption and the permanent income hypothesis of consumption, all of which state that based upon data, historical data and all, that the demand for goods and services is very stable. It's very stable because human beings, as much as possible, refuse to make radical alterations in their standard of their way of life. And, and an essential part of their way of life would be the goods that they purchase. Okay? There are many aspects of one's way of life. Your religious observations, your civic activities, and the like. But the purchase of goods and services, the consumption, is, of course, an important element of one's way of life, one's lifestyle. And generally, people do not want major changes there, which is why, therefore, the transactions demand for money is quite stable. However, money also has another function, which is it's a store of value, meaning to say money itself has value. Its value lies in its purchasing power, and the purchasing power can change over time. Okay? And this is the further peculiarity of money as a commodity. Okay, because when we talk about burger is burger, there might be some variations if we go from Wings to McDonald's to food is always my default example because I guess my graduate classes are only scheduled around the time when I start to get hungry for dinner. But anyway, bear with me. So when you talk about burgers, there'll be variations from Jollibee to Wendy's to higher end places like Brothers Burger or tawag nun, Hard Rock Cafe. But essentially, ganun, may standard feature na siya. Maybe there are differences in size, in ingredients, in manner of preparation, but the features are standard. Okay. When it comes to money, ang problema sa money would be anything that is acceptable as a medium of exchange and as a store of value. And as a medium of exchange and a store of value, money can appear in a wide variety of forms. Pwede siyang currency in circulation and demand deposits. It's the most basic. M1, pwede siyang savings deposit and time deposit plus M1, ayan ang M2. M3 would be M2 plus reverse repurchase papers, and there's M4, M5. And they include a wider variety of financial assets apart from bank deposits, bonds and commercial papers, both of which are debts. Bonds would be debts issued by the government, commercial papers issued by private entities, although sa macro, bond is used as the more general term for any debt, kasama na dyan yung commercial papers. But when it comes to finance, we differentiate between bonds and commercial papers because bonds being issued by the government is traditionally regarded as the safest, higher yielding asset. Kasi nga, mas mataas ang interest rate ng bonds compared to bank deposits, but there is a minimum amount. Right now, I think a minimum is parang 100,000. And medyo matagal ang liquidity. Liquidity is either from 30 to 180 days. You have to wait during that period of time to get back your money, but with interest, and the interest is higher than for bank deposits. That's why many see it as a worthwhile investment. Then you have equities, which are shares of stock. And then you can have also foreign exchange. And foreign exchange, not just cash in foreign exchange, but the other financial assets which are in foreign money. So you're talking about bank deposits, bonds, commercial papers, and equities in US dollar, in euro, in Hong Kong dollar, and the like. Okay. And that would be other financial assets like derivatives and the like. Moreover, um, the thing about bonds and commercial papers is that you can actually trade them. You bought the bond, you bought the commercial paper, it's a debt instrument. There's a bond. I just don't know if we have a well-developed bond market. In the US and developed countries, meron silang uh, secondary market for bonds. Ang secondary market is this. The primary market is when you purchase directly. There's the primary market for bonds and commercial papers when you directly purchase these, okay? Then there's also the primary market for equities when you directly purchase shares of stock from the corporation. Usually, pag meron tinatawag na initial public offering, yung IPO, ayun. Get in touch with your broker and purchase, IPO, that's the primary market. But the secondary market is the one that really determines market value. Ang secondary market for bonds, commercial papers, and stocks is that we know the secondary market for stocks, which is the stock market. Kaya doon, yung mga may-ari ng stock, pinagbibili sa iba. Okay? There are those who buy and sell stocks. And it's the stock exchange valuation that matters. It's the one that can raise the value of your stock. Okay? Had I known this, siguro mayaman na ako. I would have retired a long time ago. And I will not, maybe I'd still bother to teach because it's always wonderful to meet young people and teach them. Pero I'll give you an example. When I was a graduate student in New York, 1988, lumabas yung initial public offering ng Microsoft. Of course, it's in the news kasi naghiwalay si Bill and Melinda. Of course, may chismis na kaya raw sila maghihiwalay. It's not that they have fallen out of love, pero pag mag-divorce sila and divide yung kayamanan nila, however they divide it, mas bababa daw ang babayaran nilang tax kasi magtataas nga ng tax si President Biden. Sa nothing else. Ang dami mga taong ang hilig gumawa ng chismis. Whether true or not, it's rather amusing to look at the lives of these wealthy people, how even their supposed romantic life ay pwedeng maapektuhan ng tax laws. But anyway, okay? Parang si Prince Andrew at si Si Fergie, yung matagal na sila nag-divorce pero nagsasama na naman sila. And in fact, they've been living together for 15 years. But they're not remarried. But saan or was I? Okay. Noong 1988, I was a graduate student sa New York, initial public offering si Microsoft. At that time, Microsoft was just starting. And actually, um, software was just starting. So it's a completely new industry. It's okay. IPO siya. It was years later when I learned that stocks of the longest, the highest long-term rate of return. Okay, of course, the value is determined by the stock market and it can be zigzagging, pwedeng tataas, babagsak. During the stock market collapse in 1999, and again in the financial crisis of 2007, 2009, and then sometime last year, bagsakan ang value ng stock. But here's the thing, nung bumagsak yung value noong 1999, tsaka noong 2007, yeah, ang laki ng nawalang value. But in comparison to the values back in the 1980s, mas mataas pa rin ang value nila. So for example, itong Microsoft, umabot siyang $92 before the 2007 great financial crisis. I checked the value kanina. So I'm going to teach and also to further humiliate myself because of my stupidity that I don't want any of it to repeat. Of course, you'll be doing stupid things, but at least don't repeat what I did, what happened. So anyway, I checked the value. Yung Microsoft is about $45 per share. Ang laki ng binagsakan. Pero noong 1988, nung mag-IPO, 1 cent lang ang Microsoft. 1988. Ngayon, $45. And I had savings at the time. I had savings $1,000. Rather than going to places, nilagay ko lang sa bank deposit and malay. I was just an economist. Saka ko na lang natutunan itong mga pasikot-sikot na ito ng wealth management. Ay, kasi kung yung $1,000 ko, I purchased Microsoft noong 1988. And besides, I wouldn't have done it kasi risky, put everything in Microsoft and you didn't even know what was the future of software or of software or information technology. Everything was just new, starting. But if you take the risk, then you take the risk. Okay? Nagbagsakan yung tech stocks noong 1999, dot-com bubble. But the point is, kung may $1,000 ako, then I would have been able to purchase about 100,000 shares of Microsoft in 1988, which means right now, those 100,000 shares would be worth 4.5 million US dollars. Can you imagine? Kaya kayo, ngayon pa lang, kung meron kayong savings, let's just buy your stock and then just leave it there. When you're a stockholder, you get dividends. That's yung dividends na you keep on reinvesting, buy additional stock and the like. Pero generally, don't play the stock market. Ito, you just keep it there until your retirement. And you're going to retire in about 30 years' time. Ako, 1988 is about, what, 33 years ago. So imagine, in 33 years, from $1,000, it would become 4.5 million US dollars. Okay. So kayo rin. Although of course you cannot do that for US stocks right now unless you really go to the States. Kasi may restriction yata if you purchase from here. But at least, pag sa Philippine stock market, malaking bagay. One of the things na I'm at least glad is that when I learned about this in the 1990s, I purchased some stocks, Jollibee, SM, and the like. So now I have a bit of a kitty. Although, of course, if I keep on comparing to having $4.5 million, pampainis sa sarili ko, but it's okay. Thank God when I made my retirement, which I'm just investing in, like, it's just one of those what could have been, and I'm teaching that all of you. Kahit nakalimutan nyo ng economics ninyo, as long as you're able to use the knowledge that you gain here, including this investment advice, you could have something in the future. And I have done my own share in preaching the good news to all of you. So anyway, going back. So ayan. So they come in a wide variety of other assets. And here's the thing. Sorry. Kasi yung mga ilan, ginagawa nila pag sa stock market or sa bonds, commercial papers, okay? Bibili. Pag magtaas ang halaga, pagbibili. And then mamaya, di babagsak, bibili na naman. And then pagtaas naman yung if you ask me, you're a gambler. And there are very many people who are into gambling. Like, okay? So if you ask me, sir, should I sell? And I say, why sell? Hold on to it until tumanda ka. And if you're able to earn money on the side on your own, tapos meron ka pa nito at may pamamana ka na kung gusto mong ipamana or kung gusto mo i-enjoy mo yun sa katandaan mo. At kung sakaling matsugi ka before then, at least may ipamamana yun. Maipamamana ka sa mga anak mo kahit hindi ka nag-enjoy. But the thing is, since meron kang, you've set this aside, yung kinikita mo, you can use it also to enjoy yourself. You don't need to keep on postponing your enjoyment until much later. Okay? Pero yung mga ilan, yung mga yun, the ones who like to play the stock market, the ones who'd like to deal with the stock market, okay, the bond market, and the like, they're into the speculative demand for money. That's why the speculative demand for money can be very, very, very destabilizing. Okay, there could be years na okay lang, the money supply is growing, and then bigla na lang magkakaroon na financial crisis. Kasi usually, sa financial crisis, mangyayari yun, there's so many people who purchased all sorts of financial assets, derivatives being the most controversial. And okay, they purchase derivatives, and then there's a market for derivatives, they trade. And maya-maya, okay, there would be a point at which some people, for whatever reason, like, isipin nila, maybe I should start selling my derivatives. You sell. Then, when some sell and then the others, biglang nakikisell. Anong nangyayari? Kung sabay-sabay nagsell, di ba bagsak ang presyo dahil sudden increase in supply. Pag bumagsak ang presyo na, ano mangyayari? Lots of people start selling all their other assets as quickly as possible in order to hold on to whatever cash. Siyempre gagawin nila mga sugarol. Okay? And if enough do that, and when I say enough, it involves huge funds because you have institutional investors and a lot of very wealthy families and investors, plus investment banks and the like. But, they control huge amount of funds, and pag ganito mangyari, suddenly they all start, selling. So bagsakan ng presyo, ayun. So the next thing, magkakaroon nga ng recession kasi ang daming tao, feeling nila, ang laking nawalang kayamanan sa kanila. So they start reducing on their consumption expenditure. And the next thing, ayan, recession. And that's the difficulty of speculative demand, which I'll discuss later. Okay? So ayan. So that's a demand for money. Now, on the supply of money, to understand the supply of money, we need to look at the structure of the financial system. Okay? Because if you look at my discussion, ayan, money appears in various forms. Cash, the bank deposits, all of these financial assets were created by the financial system. And incidentally, when you're talking about people engaging in the speculative demand for money, they would also place them in items which are not necessarily financial in nature, but uh, they could still make quick earnings kung maswerte sila, like real assets, like real estate. Kaya katakot-takot na mga real estate developments, hindi lang dito sa Pilipinas. And I say Pilipinas kasi marami na rin sa Cebu, Iloilo, but throughout the world. They construct expensive condominium developments. Condominium, I use the Filipino term. Because in the USA, ibang ibig sabihin ng condominium sa UK. Okay? But more or less, what I'm talking about here is that you have lots of these tall buildings with lots of apartments. So many people with money spare will purchase several units of this condominium. Hindi naman para tirhan. They aim to wait for the value of these to go up and then they sell. Yung tinatawag sa US na they'll flip it. Okay? Kaya you do have TV shows, HGTV, House and Garden Television, about the flippers, mga ganyan, flipping iba. They purchase, tapos aayusin, then they resell at a much higher price. Okay? So it's also a form of speculative demand for money. O yun namang iba, they don't flip it, but they will have it rented out. And then they keep on maximizing the rental income by not having long-term rental contracts. So yeah, it's really speculative, but it's a form, an extension of the speculative demand for money. And then of course there are those people who purchase jewelry and metals, and then those that purchase art and antiques. Okay, and the important thing about art and antiques is that their value will go up kung very, very limited ang supply. That's why the most valuable artworks, as they say, of course, very, very valuable are artworks that were made by the artists who already died. Hindi mo rin pwedeng padamihin pa. Diyan na yan. But it said the most valuable artworks would be those made by artists whom you know and no one else knows that are already about to die. Kaya pwede mo nang pagbibilhin. Pag ayan na, pag na-chogi na yung tao, ayan, pagbili mo na tataas ng halaga. Okay. Then of course, you have commodities. The commodities themselves are not the ones which are going to be a financial gain. Rather, it's the contracts on the commodities. So for example, you purchase a forward contract on rice and then or pork, and then you say, okay, I purchase it right now at say $100 a ton. I don't know if that is, but anyway, just by way of argument, I'll purchase rice at $100 a ton. Okay, I expect delivery in 90 days. Okay, in 90 days, ayan, nabayaran mo na at $100, 90 days, i-deliver sa iyo. And who knows if in 90 days, the $100 a ton, umabot na ng, say, $250. Okay, now you have all that rice, and the important thing is, it can now be resold at a much higher value. Kumita ka. Or before the 90 days are up, you can sell the contract. Okay? Meron ding tawag nito, secondary market for commodities contracts. I don't know how well developed it is here in the Philippines. Pero definitely in US and Europe, ang dami. That's the reason why right before the financial crisis, 2007, for those of you who remember, before that, nagtataas ng presyo, katakot-takot ng mga kalakal, okay? Prices went up, petroleum prices went up, pork prices went up. It's not because of a shortage of these commodities or because of a surge in the demand for these commodities. It was because of the increasing demand and the speculation on their contracts, on the forward contracts on these commodities. Okay? Kasi that's part of the speculative demand. Tapos may bago na naman ngayon, itong cryptocurrency. Yan. So when some people, like my own friends, classmates, lalapit sa akin, tapos, oh, what do you think of cryptocurrency? Okay ba yun? Okay ba yun? Then I said, bakit? Kasi naman ang halaga nito dati. Siya, I usually say, tanga ka ba? Of course, magagalit sa akin. Bakit daw? Kasi people who are excited about cryptocurrency, yung mga gagawin nag-get rich quick. Pag get rich quick, pwede ka rin mag-get poor even quicker. Kasi you are taking a gamble. Okay? Hindi yan tulad ng mga, people who invest for the long term. When you purchase your share of stock ng bata ka pa, you hold on to it, malaki na. Ito yung mga cryptocurrency. Number one, they are not under any regulation by government. Number two, usually the people who are in charge here are anonymous. So, ibibigay mo yung pera mo doon. Kasi the thing about cryptocurrencies would be, tawag nito, it's a data mining computer algorithm. Tinuro yan sa akin ng isa kong estudyante who wrote a thesis. It's a data mining algorithm. Nobody really knows who originally developed it. Mga later developments na may nagpakilala na yung mga malalaki, mga original, nobody knew who were behind it. So that because they're data mining algorithm, they can only produce so many units. Kaya because of the scarcity value, ayan, mabilis syempre tumaas yung halaga. And then, some people discovered how the algorithm works. And then they started what is known as data mining. They started to create additional units na yung mga dating mga nagpasimuna, they don't even know who these people are. So kung gusto mo makipagsapalaran at mag-get rich quick, di humanda ka rin, baka ma-get poor even quicker ikaw. Remember, there already are cases of yung mga nagpatipuno ng mga cryptocurrency na mga yan na namatay. And nobody knows the password. So how can anyone retrieve the investment? O ayan, mga cryptocurrency. Ibang cryptocurrency sa digital currency. Kasi digital currency, like the one that China is starting, at least is still under control and supervision by government. Kaya kumbaga, kung may magkaloko-loko, you can still run after the government to do something about it. Pero ang dami kasi mga gago, gusto mga alam niyo na, tawag nito, kasi walang pakialam diyan ng gobyerno, nasa labas ng gobyerno, hindi yan mare-regulate ng gobyerno. Sa loob, di kanino ko ngayon aasa, yung mga nandiyan sa likod niya na mga hindi mo kilala kung sino. Tsaka gusto kang lokohin. Because, kung yun ang kasabihan wala namang manloloko kung walang nagpapaloko. At kaya nagpapaloko kasi ayan, gahaman kayo, you want to earn money quick. Dapat noon pa you should buy. So sabihin, kasi matanda na raw siya. Eh, tanga ka, magtiis ka na lang. Ito na lang gawin mo, turuan mo ng maayos yung mga anak. Let teach them to start investing now. And anyway, that's it. Yan na ang yan ang aking pagmamarunong at pangangaral. Now we continue. Okay, when we talk about the supply of money, there are two basic types. The commercial banking system and the central banking system. Okay? Ngayon, when I say commercial bank, it's a very, very specific term in monetary financial economics kasi within the banking system, among lawyers and those who are actually finance, there are some banks that call themselves commercial bank of so and so. Then you have Banco de Oro. Then there's BPI savings, okay? And then some call themselves the commercial bank. There used to be a Philippine Commercial Industrial Bank. But yeah. The thing though is in monetary economics, when you say a commercial bank, it's a term for any bank that can create or destroy acceptable substitutes to the most basic form of money. Tulad nga nung binigay kong halimbawa kanina. For example, the basic form of money is cash. And only government can print cash and mint coins. Only government can do that. However, banks can create acceptable substitutes to cash. Kaya they created demand deposits, savings, time deposits, and the like. Kaya those are acceptable substitutes to cash. And dahil commercial bank and they create acceptable substitutes to cash, they can actually create or destroy money. Money as anything that functions as medium of exchange and store of value. Halimbawa, kaya na itong M1, currency in circulation, CC. The amount of cash, hindi yan nababago. That's determined by the Banco Central. They can bring out new notes and the like, but they can also retire old notes. Kaya the growth of money is controlled. And it has, in fact, been controlled since the 1990s. That has been one of the reasons for the long period of steady growth in the Philippine economy from 2001 until 2019. Longest period in Philippine economic history of continuously positive GDP growth. Yeah, so hindi masyado nagbabago yan. However, banks can create demand deposits. They can accept checking accounts, savings deposits, and the like. And keep in mind, na yung mga checking accounts, savings, time deposits, many of them, when these were opened, hindi cash ang ipinasok. They also brought in checks. So it's possible that, okay, it's not possible, it always happens, that the currency in circulation remains more or less the same. However, dumami ang checking accounts, dumami ang savings, dumami ang time deposit, which means M1, M2, M3 all went up, which means money supply increased. Okay? Keep in mind, the supply of cash has not changed, but money supply increased because money includes hindi lang cash. In fact, the bulk of money is not in cash, but in acceptable substitutes to cash, like demand deposits, savings, time deposits, and other financial assets, all of which were created by the banking system, specifically by the commercial banking system. Okay? Now, okay. If they can create money, they can also destroy it. Okay? There'll be instances, for example, when they might have to reduce on demand deposits. They usually will do this, let's say, if they want to call on loans, when they could inform their borrowers na we're very sorry, we have to call back your loans. We have to close. Let's say, lalo na if there are certain regulations from the Bangko Sentral, which I'll discuss in a while. And ayan, so they would have to call back loans. Loans are peculiar kasi usually when you borrow from a bank, um, lalo na yung mga big loans for business and like not so much consumer loans, housing, uh, car loans. Usually they just give you the check once the loan is approved. But for big loans like for business and like, what they do is they open a bank account for you. And then with that bank account now, you can use it now for your purchases and the like. Kaya when banks have to call back on the loans or, or close down some of the loans for various reasons, okay, what it means is they're reducing the checking accounts and demand deposits. Kaya ano mangyayari? Again, cash, supply of cash currency in circulation, hindi na bago, pero bumagsak ang demand deposits. So you have a decrease in money supply, a decrease in M1. Money has been destroyed. Okay. And commercial banks are able to do that through the system known as fractional reserve banking. Banking system in the modern financial world, modern financial economy that was first invented way back in the Middle Ages by Italians. And the second important form of an institution in a modern banking system is a central bank, or the central bank. Again, the term central bank is a technical term which refers to the bank whose primary function is to control and manage the supply of money. Okay, so since it's already a little after 7, I'll start from here. We can have our break right now. Okay, so we start. Okay, so in the last class, I discussed with you the fact that commercial banks are able to create and destroy acceptable substitutes for money through the fractional reserve banking system. Okay? With the fractional reserve banking system, what this means is that only a fraction of the total liabilities are kept in reserve in the form of the most basic type of money. Okay. So let's say nowadays, if the bank has total deposit liabilities of say 1 trillion pesos, the total cash in the vault is actually just 200 million pesos. So if you look at it, you wonder, what does that mean? Does that mean that if we were to go there and start to withdraw our cash deposits, that there won't be enough cash? Well, if all of us were to go at the same time, we have what is called a bank run, then yes, you have the discovery that there isn't enough cash to handle the withdrawal of all the bank deposits, especially since very many, as I mentioned previously, when they open their accounts, they actually open not by depositing cash. Most opened their accounts with checks. But the reason why bank runs would not be very usual, very is that in general, you see, there is a trust in the banking system. It is a certain infrastructure of trust. that we trust that the bank will give us our cash anytime that we want to withdraw. And we trust that the bank is managing its affairs very well so that it remains solid. That means to say, the main source of earnings of a bank will be in its loans, and loans are a function of the bank's own ability to do their credit investigation very well so that they know and have gone through a thorough investigation on the capacity to pay of their creditors. So if they were very judicious in the management of funds, then their loan portfolio will be very solid. A lot of the loans will be paying. Okay. In fact, that was one of the problematic elements during the banking crisis in the 1980s and the last few years of the Marcos administration, because the Marcos government forced so many banks to lend to so many companies, which are essentially the crony companies, and later on, very, very many of them could no longer pay. They got the loans through political connections and not through valid um, financial evaluation. So there's a huge problematic loan portfolio. So just why since then, the banks here in the Philippines have been very, very careful and very, very judicious. Their own self-interest is at play. They realize that they have to be really, really judicious in the management of their loan portfolio and the like. And even when we're talking about banks with known political connections and the likes, they can be quite open about it, okay? Like BDO and the like. Still, they have been very, very careful. They have been very, very careful in terms of the choice of their loan portfolios and their investment. So this is the reason why bank runs would have to be very, very uncommon, because it means that we do have trust in the bank that we can withdraw money, our cash. Okay, I'll be very, when talking about monetary economics, at times you have to be very, very clear what sort of money you're talking about. It can be misleading. Say, oh, the money is not there, or the money. Here, I say, we trust them that we can withdraw our cash anytime. But because of this trust, we leave it there. We trust them. And in general, it's also the case that we have trust, not just in one bank or the bank we're putting our money, but in the entire banking system. Okay. And in fact, there's this book, The History of Central Banking, written by a former classmate and very good friend of mine, the late Curcio Giannini from Italy, where he wrote the last few months of his life, the cancer. He was able to complete the book, and it's a very, very interesting book if you can obtain it. It's called The History of Central Banking by Curcio Giannini. And he argued there, because as I'll be discussing with you in a while, the central banking system's main function was to control and regulate the supply of money. But Curcio Giannini now argues that if you really look at the main achievements of the central banks in general, he studied those in Europe, the Federal Reserve, he said their main accomplishment, their main achievement has been maintaining trust, general trust in the banking system, which is why by putting our cash in the banking system and then we just use cash substitutes created by the commercial bank, it has made transactions much, much faster. And they created a wider variety of financial assets, um, such as bank deposits, time deposits, and the like, which made it possible to to purchase other assets like shares of stock, bonds, and the like. And therefore, it is this infrastructure of trust which allows the banks to function and which allows banks effectively to create and destroy money through the system of fractional reserve banking. Okay, now I think I discussed that in great detail in the last class, its origins and the like. So if I may proceed again, just to talk about the expansion of capitalism. As I discussed with you in the last class, the expansion, the banking system began among the Italian merchants, which in which they began essentially a warehousing service. Most of the traders in Italy were accumulating a lot of gold, since gold and silver were the main currencies with international acceptability. Okay? There was no US dollar yet, or an overpowering economy whose money would be the one to be used elsewhere. Gold and silver by themselves are metals with value, so they were accepted in international trade. So eventually you have traders, merchants, prestigious and respected, who provided a warehousing service. They began to, uh, accept deposits of gold and issue warehouse receipts, which is the origins of paper money. And in time, the paper money would be acceptable as medium of exchange. So now you have the circulation of a lot of these warehouse receipts. And in time, bankers began to establish correspondent relations with each other. So for example, when you have business person in Florence who has some of these paper money and will have to be, say, in Venice to make a purchase, and the Venetian would see his warehouse receipts with a signed by a merchant banker that they know of. The Venetian will just accept the paper. And then what the Venetian will do is to go to his own banker in Venice. They usually were men, not very, very many women. There were just very few. And if you excuse my gender language, so the merchant will then go to his banker in Venice, deposit the sheet of paper that the Venetian banker will accept. And what happens is the Venetian banker will just get in touch with the Florentine banker, and then they just put in, note in the ledger. It therefore facilitated the movement of goods and people from Florence to Venice and the like, and there was no need for a physical transfer of gold and silver. Everything was just a case of, a ledger, note in the ledger saying that this cash, this money in the form of warehouse receipts will be added to the accounts of the Venetian, which the Florentine will then just reduce. And there is no physical transfer of gold or silver now. Okay, because these banks now have this correspondent relationship with each other. Therefore, you have the result, a much faster movement of goods and of people across borders, therefore greater economic activity. Okay, and when I was discussing with you the Marxian theory of development, where the landlords got involved in the production and sale of commodities, they have a market. Okay. This was again facilitated by the Italian merchant bankers. They are the ones doing the trading. They can purchase the goods sell them for profit, and they will also bring to the aristocratic households very, very valuable imported items like porcelain and silks from China, gold from India, show off their wealth and power, and at the same time, items that they will need, like the latest weaponry, furniture, and the like. And payment was done again, largely these warehouse receipts. So there was no need for physical transfer of gold and silver, and that substantially facilitated trade and the movement of goods and people across countries over several decades. So you have this gradual expansion of economic opportunities throughout Europe and the gradual evolution of Western European feudalism into modern day capitalism. Okay. Ganon din ang paraan para sina Jose Rizal ay makapagbiyahe, makapag-aral at tumira sa Europa. Nangyayari, yung ama niya, si Don Francisco, pupunta sa isang bangko dito sa Binondo. Binondo was the original financial center of the Philippines. It's along, the banks were originally located doon sa Rosario, Calle Rosario sa Binondo. Rosario is now Quintin Paredes. That's why there are still a number of very beautiful old buildings there that used to belong to banks, and in fact, they're still named after those banks. There's the Hong Kong Shanghai Banking Corporation building and the like. So they all started moving to Makati in mga late 1960s and 1970s when the Ayalas developed Makati very, very well. Kaya gumanda ang infrastructure doon. Whereas yung Manila, like most places in the Philippines at the time, neglected, and up to this day, ang pangit na infrastructure doon. Roads are bumpy. There's a lot of garbage around. Anyway, so that was where we had our financial system, the financial center. So pupunta si Don Francisco Mercado, he will deposit cash to bank there, and the usual is Hong Kong Shanghai Banking Corporation. Okay, those were the British banks. Kaya siya tinawag na Hong Kong Shanghai Banking Corporation because there are British banks that had their headquarters in Hong Kong and Shanghai. Okay, ang ganda ng mga British, they name an establishment that they might own after the place where it is located. Kaya meron sila ditong membership club noon, ang tawag nila the Manila Club, which is only for them, only for the British. Although Manila Club, hindi pwede yung mga Pilipino, kahit yung mga Espanyol, hindi pwede. But anyway, so Don Francisco will bring the money, the cash, to Hong Kong Shanghai Banking Corporation. Hong Kong Shanghai Banking Corporation will just send a telegraph to its head office in London, and then the head office in London will then send a telegram, telegram where the fastest forms of communication again, but they're wired. Kaya meron ng communication wires, cables which go undersea. There's a very, very long cable from the Philippines, Hong Kong, and the like, punta sa dagat at pumapasok sa Egypt, and then diretso na sa Italy yon, and then you have wires throughout Europe. It usually takes about 24 hours to send a telegram. And the London office takes in the telegram from Hong Kong, and then they get in touch with their correspondent bank in Madrid and tell them, get in touch with this person. This is the address, wala po ng telepono, susulat sila. And then Jose Rizal, Antonio Luna can now go to the bank in Madrid and they get their cash in the local currency for them. So there's no actual transfer of cash anymore from Manila all the way to Madrid. Everything is just a case of writing something in the ledger. So that makes movement of goods and people faster. And to this day, ganun pa rin ang ginagawa ng mga bank. For those of you who have experienced traveling abroad, you don't need to bring your cash. Basta't may ATM ka, tas nasa ibang bansa ka, nakita mo yung ATM, member of this, and then yung ATM mo dito sa Pilipinas, member of that network, ayun, use it, and then you can get the cash in the local currency equivalent. Kaya hindi mo na kinakailangan magdala pa ng cash. Kaya ako nagdududa at nagtataka pag may mga balita na di ba yung may nahuli daw sa Europe itong mga military officers with $200,000 or 200,000 euros. Ang sa akin, ba't ka magdadala ng ganun kalaking pera? Just as just as the case na when noon may yung landlord ko was requesting tataasan daw niya ako ng rent kasi napagnakawan daw siya. Sabi talaga po, oo, ninakaw sa kanya parang 180,000. So, paano po nangyari? Kasi daw, he needed to make some payment for whatever. Kinailangan niya mag-withdraw ng 180,000 kasi di ako naman siyempre, ba't mo kayo mag-withdraw ng kalaking pera? Pwede naman kayo mag-issue ng cheque. Kaya mangyayari pag ma ilabas yung ganyang kalaking pera, natural, lalapitan kayo, may makakapansin. Sana cheque na lang ang ipinambayad kung ano. Siyempre, hindi niya maamin kung ano yung dahilan. Dahil napangaralan ko siya, ayun, nahiya tuloy para taasan ako ng anyway, ganyan. So therefore, what I'm saying is that the modern financial system, the way it first emerged in Italy and spread throughout Europe, was also a very, very important instrument in the expansion of trade and in the move of peoples by creating acceptable substitutes to cash, or in the medieval era for gold and silver, and developing correspondent banking relationships and establishing a reliable and trustworthy image among people with money, they were able to just transfer funds very easily without any physical transfer, just by recording, that made it possible for goods and people to travel across borders. And therefore, over time, you have increasing incomes, increasing profits, increasing business opportunities, increasing wealth. Right? And ang origin kung bakit Italy is a style center, okay? Center for high fashion, center for higher achievements in culinary arts, and also arts and the like. Kasi mayaman sila. Okay? Pag maraming taong napakayaman sa isang lugar, pati yung mga yan bibili ng mga mamahaling damit, alahas, maghahanda ng mariringal na kainan, ayun. So the ending style center, the original style center, which is why naalala ko may estudyante ako, nagkumuha siya ng masters in fashion marketing sa London yata. So, nagulat siya na, it's fashion, but you had to learn so many things about fashion. A lot of the terminologies, like yung mga style ng pagsulsi, pagtahi, pagtabas, a lot of the terminologies in fashion, including male fashion, were Italian terms. Just as a lot of the terms in music, nga mano destra, using the right hand, andante, allegro, which you hear in ABBA songs, they're all Italian kasi silang nagpatipulat silang mga unang yumaman. Okay, so that's the expansion of capitals. Now, let's look at what a central bank is. The function of a central bank, originally, as I told you, was to regulate the supply and volume of money and credit. And eventually, it functioned to maintain trust and the integrity of the entire banking system. The oldest central bank is the Bank of England, established in 1694. Okay, and there's a reason why a central bank can emerge only in the late 1600s, whereas the commercial banks, as I discussed with you last time, were established in Italy in the medieval. Okay, that's because it took a long time, but by the 1600s, a lot of banks in many parts of Europe were already well established. Okay, and by the 1600s also, you have now the emergence of centralized national governments, because remember before, no medieval era, ang dami mga feudal wars. Merong tinatawag na may England, may France, may Spain, but they're actually not national governments, essentially. Alliance lang yun. Lords fighting the other lords. They would have a king, it's their leader. But a national government began to emerge only in 1600s. By national government, one government that collects the taxes and has the army, and it's and it has the administrative apparatus to govern the entire country. And in all countries in Europe, they tended to be the military and the household administration, the kings. So this emerged in the 1600s. Okay? Spain in the 1500s, Portugal in the 1500s, France, England consolidated themselves in the 1500s. Kaya by the end of the 1600s, the Bank of England was established, and this originally was just an association of British banks, and their main purpose is to regulate themselves in order to maintain the integrity of the banking system. Kasi through centuries, there will always be banks that fool around with people's money. Pera yun eh. So magkakaroon ka ng bank run, kinakailangan sarahan yung banko, and then you'll have to rebuild once more trust in the rest of the banking system. Because usually if there's just one bank na magkaroon ng problema at mabank run, people will now begin to doubt the other banks kasi nga pare-pareho lang naman ang fractional reserve na sinusunod nila. So it was a big thing for the business people in Europe, especially here in England, to start policing themselves, regulating themselves. Okay. Ang dahilan kung bakit sa neoclassical economic analysis palaging paniwalang-paniwala tayo sa the market can regulate itself. We just rely on the self-interest of the households and firms, and you'll have an optimal social outcome. Kasi yung mga British noon pa talaga may ugali na sila, and also some other countries in Europe, where people of a certain industry form guilds or associations, and they enforce regulations on themselves to maintain the integrity of their profession. Kaya nun sa London, to this day, meron silang guilds, yung mga fishmongers, yung mga nagtitinda ng isda. Yun, may mga regulations sila na bawal magtinda ng isdang ilang araw na huli, yung mga ganon. You have the steel workers, you have the garments makers. Then they formed ito Bank of England, established in 1694. Its headquarters is in Threadneedle Street in the City of London. City of London, parang kumbaga dito sa Pilipinas, parang Intramuros. When you say the word London, para dito, pag sabihin mong Manila, there's the City of Manila, and then there's Metro Manila. And actually, there's also an older Manila, which is Intramuros. Ay, ganun din sa London. When you say London, if you mean the City of London, this is a small area, the oldest part of the city, which also happens to be the financial center. Then there's London, the City of London with 32 other cities and towns which form Greater London, para sa atin Metro Manila. Okay. And the headquarters of the Bank of England is called the Central Bank. Yun na nga, nasa Threadneedle Street because that used to be the street where yung mga sa street modista nandun yung kanilang mga tolda, yung Threadneedle Street. Mga kalye sa London, ganun parang yung hanap buhay ng maraming tao. So that is one. Threadneedle Street, then meron kang ano yan, there's a street there that has reference to sellers of fish, mga ganun, or cheap side. That means lahat ng mga mura na pinagtitinda usually second hand, or more usually mga ninakaw as a cheap side. Okay? So anyway, parang dito sa Maynila, the street before like Arroceros sa Maynila, which is Arroceros means mga nagtitinda ng bigas, ng arroz. Okay? Tapos dun sa Binondo may Haboneros, mga nagtitinda ng habon, ng sabon. That's why I always tell my students, pag kayo friend ako, tapos you had your chance to travel abroad, kasi may picture taking, ipopost mo. Kala mo naman ma-impress ako may picture ka sa Eiffel Tower, sa Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle. So, lahat ng mga tao na pumupunta doon nagpapapicture taking. Pero just magpakita ka naman na may natutunan ka mula sa akin. Why not have a picture of yourself in front of headquarters of the Bank of England? Magandang building yun. It's in the center of the city. Yeah, why? Yeah. So at least ma-impress, may natutunan ka mula sa akin. Picture taking of me in front of the bank. Okay? Yan. Saka mangyayari pag mag-picture taking ka doon, just ikaw lang siguro. If there are other people there, they may have been my former students. Okay? So anyway, so it was the central bank that developed systems in order to manage and control the supply of money, but systems that also ended up maintaining the integrity of the entire banking system. And the tools here, known as the tools of monetary management, and these tools work within the logic of the fractional reserve banking system. First is that they impose a reserve ratio requirement. Tulad na sinabi ko, it's a fractional reserve, they only keep a percentage, a fraction of the total cash, or total deposit liabilities in the form of cash. So my example was 1 trillion pesos total deposits, and the total cash involved is 200 million pesos. So this is a 20% reserve requirement, which, as you can see, malaki ang opportunity cost sa bank. They could still earn if they lend out the 200 million pesos. Okay? So pwedeng they loan out more money. So aabot na ng 2 trillion pesos yung kanilang deposit liabilities given cash involved of 200 million pesos, and that effectively becomes a 10% reserve ratio requirement, which now becomes a bit risky for the bank. Kasi what if, yun na nga, okay, 10% ang reserve ratio, but for some reason, biglang dumami yung nagwi-withdraw ng cash. Let's say, magpapasko na, or more usually may biglang emergency, like for example, nung Enero last year, nung sumabog si Taal. So, all businesses, all offices, all schools had to be closed, or nagkaroon ng quarantine. And so, bigla na lang dadami yung mga mag-withdraw ng cash. And there's a problem if, pansin ng, ba't kulang ang cash nito? So, oftentimes, the central bank becomes the lender of the last resort. They should promise to send cash to these banks. But the other way of doing that is to prevent precisely a situation like that arising. They put in a minimum reserve ratio, which right now is about 13%. So therefore, it's 200 million pesos in cash. They can put in up to 1.7 trillion pesos in deposits. Okay, okay lang. Pero wag naman 2 trillion pesos. Malaking bagay pa rin yung 300 million pesos additional deposits. Okay, yun, may reserve ratio requirement. Then the other one, yung tinatawag na open market operation. Ang gagawin ng bangko is they can keep the okay, when the reserve ratio requirement is increased, it means that Bangko Sentral wants the supply of money to increase. Kasi tinaasan mo yung reserve ratio requirement. So dapat bumaba ang deposits ng bangko. Pag binaba ng reserve ratio requirement, tataas ang supply of money. Mas mababa na yung reserve ratio requirement. And usually, they keep their cash in the vault. They never give it out. I mean, it's an asset. And most people really don't like use cash. So for most transactions, and transactions usually involve big amounts of money, just use a check. Kaya nga may kasabihan kung mas gustong gamitin cash ay nakakapagduda na yun. Kaya ang hanap buhay nito mga ito. Baka sabihan kung ang dami niyang mga tig-25 pa yan sa kweteng yan. Kung ang daming tig-100 piso ay drug siguro. Pag ang daming 1,000 pesos at saka halos ang lilinis pa ng 1,000 pesos. So, siguro kidnapper yan, no? Ever. Yeah. So generally, ganon talaga. For most people, the judicious way is to use checks, not cash. And ano naman ang open market operation? Okay, hindi binago ang reserve ratio requirement. Okay? Let's say 13%. So you can have sabihin na 20%. So 200 million peso cash, 1 trillion peso total deposit liabilities. Gagawin ng central bank, they issue bonds. Yung bonds nila, debts. Okay. So they issue bonds saying, okay, we're selling you these bonds and payable in 30 to 90 days, interest of so much, usually mataas ang interest. So what the banks do is they buy these bonds and they buy using their cash involved. Again, hindi na nag-transfer ng cash from the vaults of the banks to the central bank. Part of the cash involved is actually in the central bank. Kaya mangyayari, babaguhin na lamang yung recording. So, yung mga bangko will, let's say this particular bank, would purchase, say, 100 million pesos of these bonds issued by the central bank. So they reduce their cash involved. Then the Bangko Central also puts it in the ledger. Okay, and they send the 100 million peso bond. So mangyayari, this bank, and all the other banks will have to reduce the deposit liabilities. Dahil 20% pa rin na reserve requirement. Kaya lang, by the sale of the bonds, 100 million pesos na lang ang cash involved. So they have to reduce their deposit liabilities from 2 trillion pesos to 1 trillion pesos. Ayan, so yun. Dito usually mapipilitan silang tawagan yung mga umutang and say, sorry, we have to close your accounts. So, yung bonds na tinatawag, okay, yun ang reverse repurchase papers. Now, later, when the central bank announces that it will sell the reverse repurchase papers, that means, so babalik dun sa mga bangko, sa bangko ito yung 100 million pesos, interest, and all. So now, ang cash involved nila balik sa 200 million. With the reserve requirement, still 20%. They can increase deposit liabilities to 2 trillion pesos. And then discount rate, ganito yun. The reserve ratio requirement has to be fulfilled every day. Okay. And then, usually at the end of the banking day, makikita ng mga bangko, ano yung total cash involved nila, ano yung total deposit liabilities, and if they fulfill the reserve ratio requirement. Some banks will have excess reserves. That means it's above the minimum to fulfill the reserve ratio requirement. Merong ilan naman, may kulang. So they will borrow from each other in what is known as the overnight market. They borrow from each other. So they should quote, hey, can I borrow from you this much at this interest for 90 days? Tsaka usually, whenever times are normal, there's always money available in the overnight market kaya hindi masyadong magtataas ang interest rate. Pag tumataas ang interest rates overnight market, it means money is tight. That's a signal that there's something wrong somewhere in the banking system. They don't seem to have enough liquidity. So, by the end of the day, the banks report to the Bangko Sentral their cash and their deposit position and report that they have fulfilled the minimum reserve ratio. Sometimes the Bangko Sentral, in wanting to increase the supply of money, can announce that they will be reducing the discount rate. The discount rate in the financial sector is the interest rate that the central bank charges on its loans. And there's only one reason why the central bank would provide loans. It's to control the supply of money. So when the central bank announces a discount rate, binababaan nila. That means for many banks, lalo na yung mga kinulangan ng reserve, they won't have a problem over for their reserve. They can borrow from the central bank at a certain discount rate. So it's all right if they have accepted, if they've given out so many loans at lumaki ng masyado yung kanilang deposit liabilities, they're able to fulfill the reserve ratio requirement. In case kulangin ng cash, they can always borrow from Bangko Sentral at this so-called discount rate. Now, when the Bangko Sentral wants to reduce the supply of money, what they usually announce is they're going to raise the discount rate. And in dire situations, when the central bank really has to reduce the supply of money, they might even announce the discount window is closed. That means hindi sila magpapautang. These terms are a remnant of the good old days. Wala pa ng internet. Ang overnight market usually happened at about 6:15, 6:30 p.m. Masyado nung stricto ang schedule. Noon, all banks have to close at 3 p.m. kasi it's a carryover from England. They had to close at 3 p.m. One of the reasons being that Jesus Christ died at 3 p.m. But the more usual explanations for purposes of security. Kasi pag autumn at winter sa England, Northern Europe, alas 3 pa lang madilim na pag autumn and winter. Ganun kaikli ang mga araw nila pag sisikat ang araw ng 9, tapos alas 3 madilim na. Bumabawi pag summer, sisikat ang araw 3 a.m. Tapos ilulubog ang araw 10 p.m. Imagine. But anyway, yeah. So magsasara mga bangko weekend kasi they have a lot to do. Tulad nga sinabi ko sa inyo, every branch will have to balance, then they'll have to report sa head office yung total cash position and deposit position. And by law, hindi pwedeng umuwi ang bank teller o ang bank manager pag hindi siya makapag-balance. And then once naka-report din at a certain hour, banks now have their clearing house. Ang clearing house when they meet, si BPI, sasabihin niya sa BDO, I have here 1 billion pesos worth of checks from you. Sasabihin ng BDO sa BPI, I have 2 billion pesos worth of checks from you. Yan, so gagawin na lamang ng BDO ay plus 1 billion, difference between what they have to give and what they have to owe the others. So yung isa wala na. Yun. And so they have a final computation of their cash reserve and their deposit position. Ayun. Pagkulang, then punta sila sa overnight market. Okay? And then pag maayos na, then they report to the Bangko Sentral, okay, by 6:30 p.m. And by that time, yun, if you don't fulfill minimum reserve ratio requirement, you pay a fine. Ang laki ng fine. Chargeable yun sa cash involved. Ngayon, because of internet, banks can remain open on more flexible basis. Some even remain open until 5 p.m. Okay? At saka itong tinatawag na overnight market, nagaganap na yan sa umaga before the banks open. Banks normally open at 9 a.m. So ang overnight market sa umaga na, pero overnight market pa rin natawag. Iba yan dun sa market sa Hong Kong. So they still use terms like overnight rate. Tapos yung discount window kasi yung mga treasurers ng mga bangko, pumupunta sila talaga sa Bangko Sentral to do the clearing house there. Kaya doon nila malalaman pag mapadaan sila, makita nila yung discount window. Pag napansin na sarado, ay ayan, hindi sila pwedeng umutang sa Bangko Sentral. Gusto maghigpit ng Bangko Sentral. So these are the standard practices of the central banks. These tools were developed by the Bank of England, the first central bank, the oldest central bank. And these are still widely used throughout the world. That's why when you have a modern financial system, you have commercial banks that practice fractional reserve banking. Then you have a central bank. And the job of the central bank is to work within the logic of the fractional reserve banking system to manage the money supply, to manage credit using these three basic tools. Halos sa buong mundo, pagsasabihin, well, at least in Europe, pag Bank of England, Bank of France, Bank of Japan, yan. Usually it means the central bank of the country. Sa USA, ang tawag ng central bank nila, the Federal Reserve banking system. Ngayon, sa Pilipinas and some other former colonies, we have a central bank called the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas. Hindi siya tinatawag na Bank of the Philippines. Kasi yung original Bank of the Philippine Islands, tinayo ito noong 1851. It was the Banco Espanyol Filipino. Isabel Sabuni. So we were still a colony of Spain. So it's Spain that makes decisions on things like monetary policy. Kaya yung Banco Espanyol Filipino was a private bank. Pero nakontrata siya na they'll be the ones in charge of printing the money of the Philippines, which is a Spanish-Filipino money. Okay? So they were the ones, they had the monopoly in the printing of money and in the minting of coins. When you make a coin, it's called minting. Okay? So, ayan. And then, nung naging kolonya na tayo ng Estados Unidos, hindi mo na siya pwede matawag na Bangko Espanyol Filipino, kaya naging siya, Banco de las Islas Filipinas, Bank of the Philippine Islands. Okay. Kaya sa English nga, Bank of the Philippine Islands. Philippine Islands was the American term before for the Philippines. Kasi tawag sa atin ng mga Espanyol, Islas Filipinas. Just the mga Europeans would call us the Philippine Islands. Okay. So, nang maging independiente ng Pilipinas, Bank of the Philippine Islands. So, our central bank that was established in 1947 ended up being called the Central Bank of the Philippines, hindi Bank of the Philippines. Okay. may kwento si certain economic historian. Kasi sa Tagalog, salita natin ay salapi. But we also use the word pera. Kaya ang paliwanag niya kasi noong 1800s, yung pera ng Pilipinas, nandun yung mukha ng reyna ng Espanya. Ganun talaga ang pera. Ang pera is issued by a government, and it and the government guarantees the value and and the interchangeability of that currency. Kaya kung titignan niyo yung ating pera nandun lagi, Republika ng Pilipinas, tapos ito ay bayarin ng Bangko Sentral, pinananagutan ito ng Bangko Sentral. Pipirma yung presidente ng Pilipinas at yung gobernador ng Bangko Sentral. Tapos may face side. Ang face side, noon kasi nagsimula yan yung mga coins noon, panahon pa ng mga Romano, kahit noon pa, para may halaga. Dun sa face side, tinatatak yung mukha ng kung sino man ang hari o emperador. Kaya yung tanyag na usapin sa Biblia, yung tinatanong ng mga Pariseo kay Jesucristo, ito, tingnan mo, ang nandito sa pera ito, mukha ni Cesar, hindi na Panginoon Diyos. Anong gagawin natin dito? Sabi ni Jesus, bigay mo kay Cesar, kay Cesar, sa Panginoon Diyos yung sa kanya. Yan. So that's why the face side always had the picture of whoever was the king or the emperor. Tapos kaya dito sa atin, para sa ibang mga bansa, yung pera natin, andun yung mukha ng kadalasan ng isang bayani. Kaya nasabi natin, oy, ang niregalo niya ay panay Aquino. Yan. Binigyan ka ng 500 pesos. So yan. Hindi yun, ang binigay niya si ano lang, si Quezon. That means binigyan ka ng 20 pesos. Okay? Kaya nga ng 1800s, yung nandun naman, si Reyna Isabel II, Reyna ng Espanya. Para ngayon, sa Britanya, yung pera nila, andun palagi mukha ni Queen Elizabeth II. Etong si Reyna Isabel II sa Espanya, ano yan apat ang anak niya, pero ang kwento ng mga Espanyol, iba-iba ang tatay. Kasi pinilit siyang pakasalan yung kanyang pinsang buo. Kasi ganun ang mga Familias Reales sa Europa. Nagpapakasal lamang sa kapwa prinsesa, kapwa prinsipe. Kaya ang mga naging asawa nila, kung hindi man taga-ibang bansa, na prinsipe o prinsesa, kadalasan pinsang buo na lang nila. Espanyol, kapwa nila, prinsipe, prinsesa, edi. Kung kapwa mo prinsipe o prinsesa, edi pinsan mo. Kaya pinakasalan niya yung kanyang pinsang buo na ang pangalan si Don Francisco. Pero ang nickname na binigay sa kanya ay si Paquita. Kaya pinilit lang siya. May kwento nga nung matanda na sila, hindi, nagkahiwalay din sila. Tapos yung kikipag-chismis si Doña Isabel sa kanyang mga ladies. Nagkikwento tungkol sa kanila. Ano ba, sex life nila. Tapos natanong si Doña Isabel, ano nangyari sa inyo nung inyong wedding? At sabi rin ang kwento, sabi rin ni Doña Isabel, masasabi ko naman sa lalaki, nung gabing nagpakasal kami, mas marami pa siyang suot na lace kesa sa akin. So, yun. So, yun na nga, dahil iba-iba ang lalaki ang tatay ng mga anak niya. Nung una popular siya, pero habang tumatagal, naiinis na yung mga Espanyol dahil nagiging masyado ng malu. Parang Imelda Marcos, ganun. Kaya mga Espanyol daw, pag nakikita nila yung salapik natin, tapos nandun yung mukha ni Isabel II, sasabihin ng mga Espanyol, la pera, la pera, pera. Ibig sabihin ng la pera ay the bitch. Yun. Kaya yung sabi nga ng isang historian, kaya daw pera ang pangalan natin sa ating salapi. pinangalan dun sa beach yung reyna ng Espanya, si Isabel II. May estatua siya sa harapan ng Malate Church. Tapos doon sa restored na Ayuntamiento, may na-restore nila yung ceiling mural, yung fresco doon. May litrato doon si Isabel II. Mas tama yung litrato doon sa Ayuntamiento. Kasi pagkataba-taba, dambuhala si Isabel II. So ayan, yan ang kasaysayan ating pera. Okay. Tapusin ko na muna ito. Lahat tatapusin ko na sa darating na linggo, and then I'll start with international trade and governance, the last two topics. So ganito yung financial system sa Europe, okay, which extended to North America, Canada, and the USA. In developing countries, Asia, Africa, and Latin America, ganun din ang ginawa ng mga bangko. They also established branches throughout Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And just like what they did in Europe, they provided credit to the local landlords to produce and export basic commodities to Europe. Europe is the main market. And then, from the new huge earnings that they made, they can now also purchase on credit the manufactured goods coming from Europe. So Europe needed a lot of materials. Yeah, they would import sugar, cotton, tobacco, hemp. Okay. The Philippines is a major producer and exporter of abaca, which has turned into ship cables, and there's a huge demand for ship cables. Okay. Kaya kung nanonood kayo ng Titanic, okay, ayon sa kasaysayan, walang Pilipino sa manifest. Pero meron dong made in the Philippines. Yung mga kable ng barko, those were abaca exported from the Philippines. Kaya nung na-discover nila yung wreck ng Titanic, wala na silang makitang kable kasi natural fiber ng abaca, kaya na ano yan gumuho sa kalaliman ng dagat. Hindi tulad mula mga 1930s or so, they were able to develop plastic cables. Kaya nawalan tuloy ng bumibili, gumagamit ng cables galing sa abaca. And yung mga yan, yun na nga, ang reklamo nga, hindi na siya environment friendly. Plastic kasi, kaya pag let's say lumubog yung barko, yun, nandun pa rin mga kable. Hindi naglalaho yung mga yan palibhasa, hindi naman natural fiber. Okay. Anyway, so ayan. So they were importing those commodities from Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And then the landlords from Asia, Africa, and Latin America were now buying manufactured goods from Europe, mga glass, metals, and the like. Kasi kaya kung titingnan nyo yung mga matatandang mga pamamahay dito sa Pilipinas, halimbawa sa Negros, sa Pampanga, sa Batangas. Okay. Ang dami din sa mga lumang bahay na ito. Halimbawa, yung kanilang bubong, yung atip. Okay. Those galvanized iron sheets were manufactured in Scotland. Sa Scotland, alam mo na, snow dun. Makapal ang snow. Kaya sa Scotland, makakapal ang kanilang mga galvanized iron sheets. Kaya yung mga dinala dito sa Pilipinas hanggang ngayon, matibay pa rin. Kasi ang kapal eh. Hindi tulad nung mula nung ang Pilipinas began to have its own steel, iron and steel industries from the 1930s and the like. Okay. Nagnipis na yung galvanized iron sheets kasi hindi naman nga talaga natin kinakal pagkakapal-kapal at hindi naman tayo nag-snow. Kaya nagnipis na, pero yun nga, hindi na sila kasing tagal, mga after 30-40 years, dapat nang palitan. Hindi tulad ng mga sa lumang bahay hanggang ngayon. Yun pa rin ang kanilang bubong, matibay. Okay. So, again, it's just like what happened in Europe. Okay. It is the financial system that became the main agent in the expansion of capitalism. Okay, and because the financial system was able to develop um, money substitutes that were very, very convenient in exchange, which therefore allowed for much more rapid movement of people and goods. And when goods and people are able to move all over wide distances, so lumalaki tuloy ang production kasi lumalaki na rin ang demand to those places where these goods can reach. So lumalaki ang production, lumalaki ang employment. So you have more and more people moving to the production of commodities for export and no longer in just more feudal modes of production. So now, so in the colonial financial system, the colonial financial systems throughout the world were integrated with the global financial system kasi nga, they're colonies. And the head offices and monetary policy were being determined in Europe. So the colonial financial systems were integrated with the global financial system. And what this meant was that the domestic interest rates were very close to the international interest rates. Okay. And the usual benchmark for international interest rates would be the LIBOR, the London Interbank Offered Rate, which as I explained to you last week and several weeks ago when I discussed the stages of growth model. London became the international financial center because a lot of the merchants, businessmen, and aristocrats of continental Europe sent their funds for deposit for safekeeping in London during the Napoleonic Wars, and that began the process by which London became the world's largest international financial center. So the benchmark international interest rate would be the London Interbank Offered Rate, and given the integration of colonial financial systems with the global financial systems, domestic interest rates in many colonies in Asia, Africa, and Latin America remain close to the international interest rates. And the domestic interest rates in the colonies reflected the domestic supply and demand for loans. And at the same time, foreign exchange loans were easy to obtain. Okay, so if they need foreign exchange loans, they can easily obtain it, which means therefore that you have a huge supply of foreign exchange, and exchange rates were stable. Now, what happened with the financial systems of Asia, Africa, and Latin America once they became independent in the 1950s? Okay, I will wrap this up in our next class. Okay, and then I'll continue with the discussion of trade and economic development and on to our last topic, which is governance and economic development. I'd be completing it definitely by May 19th. All right. So, are there any questions or comments? I think we went beyond the allotted time. I should know because I'm very, very tired. Exhausted. Ang hirap dito sa quarantine na ito. Basta palagi na ako nakaupo. Walang masyadong exercise. Hindi tulad noon. Ang exercise ko pag may classes, alam mo na, yung lalakad ako mula sa department sa classroom, palaging nakatayo, babalik na naman. So in a sense, my lifestyle at the time really forced me to do a lot of physical activity. Pero hindi tulad nito. I mean, I miss those because palagi kang nakaupo. Suppose we all start. So we just keep on praying. Somehow, at least by Christmas, pwede tayo magkaharap-harapan at least with our families, our loved ones. Anyway, any questions? Okay, so if there are no questions for now, you can always email me. I can set up Zoom meeting. Just make sure na if you want to consult with me, ang requirement lang at least tatlo tayo. Hindi pwedeng one-on. So, okay, if there are no more questions, I'll see you next week. We continue. So, good night. Take care,
Thank
all
you,
of you.
sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you
Thank
po,
you,
sir.
And
Thank you,
I'm
sir.
going,
Thank you po.
okay, my pleasure. I'm also going to make an announcement in advance para makapaghanda na kayo. Siguro next week, definitely in our last class, mag-screenshot tayo. So, yun, pwede na kayong maghanda for that next week or May 15, whichever ends up being our last class. Okay? Sige. So, good night, everybody.
Bye.
Take care. I'll see you all next week. Okay?